As we move to a deeper understanding of collaboration, the first thing we want to do is to bring you a panel entitled Rethinking Collaboration, a Business Perspective. Now, our two speakers will tell us about the opportunities and the challenges inherent to their businesses. These two people represent Mars and Standard Chartered. I think most of you are familiar with these firms. Mars is one of the largest food and beverage companies in the world, and Standard Chartered does business in 68 countries, including many of which are developing. So I would like to have Barry Parkin start his way up here, if you will. Don't applaud yet. Barry oversees work for Mars incorporated in two areas critical to the company's future business success and its role as a corporate citizen. As Chief Sustainability Officer at Mars, Barry is responsible for developing and driving the company's sustainability programs across the value chain, from farmers through to consumers. In the 2.5 years he's held this position, Barry has worked with businesses sourcing, developing, sharpening, articulating Mars's corporate sourcing strategies, and with the operational teams to build the programs that make the company's operations sustainable in a generation. Barry's also chairman of the World Cocoa Foundation. Please welcome Barry Parkin. I think that your mic is going to work well enough, but just in case, you might want to test it. Is it turned on?
Yeah, how's the mic working? Good. Great. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, John. There's been a fair amount of improvisation going on up here, hasn't there? I wonder what's going to happen behind me as I'm going on. There was a suggestion I was going to play the piano, but I can assure you that wouldn't be a good idea. So as John said, I'm going to look at, provide some context on poverty through an agricultural lens. And so, have we got any charts? Ah, excellent. So, so why agriculture? Well, I guess the first is sort of obvious in that I work for a food business, and no surprise, food businesses are based on agriculture, and I've worked for Mars for 32 years, so it's probably all I know. So I'm going to focus on the agricultural element of this challenge. You know all of our brands. I'm not going to do a PR exercise on Mars. I think people know who we are. Pet food, chocolate business, our two biggest businesses, but fundamentally businesses based on agriculture. The second reason I wanted to take an agricultural lens is that it's a big deal for agriculture. So let's start just by looking at a few numbers. So 500 million smallholder farmers in the world, give or take. I don't think anybody knows the real number, but it's around about 500 million smallholder farmers in the world. And they are supporting well over 2 billion people. So well over a quarter of the world's population are inherently dependent on smallholder farmers. And I think, as we all know, they are the poorest people on the planet. So smallholder farmers in agriculture are core to the reason that you've come to this room today. Now, about 200 million of that 500 million are in supply chains. So they're not producing just for themselves. They're producing products for either local consumption, cash crops, or that are going into global supply chains. I think if we went to any supermarket here in Oxford, a Tesco, a Sainsbury's, a Waitrose, or whatever, and you walk down those aisles, at least half the products in that store are connected to those 200 million smallholder farmers. So this isn't something way away from us. This is something that's connected to our everyday activities, to the household products that we all consume, both here in Oxford, in the UK, and across the world. So the world's business is connected to those 200 smallholder farmers. And then when we get down to the Mars business, we're connected to about 500,000 of those smallholder farmers. So about 1,000th of the smallholder farmers in the world are connected to Mars's supply chain. So business is important, and you multiply us by the hundreds of other businesses, and you start to get a sense of how business is connected to those smallholder farmers. And let's remember, those smallholder farmers are the poorest people in the world. So that's the issue. That's why we're talking about agriculture. And, but it's not just about numbers, is it? It's about people. And they're people that I've met through my career at Mars. They're people that you've met in your careers, smallholder farmers around the world. And many of them are not doing great. They're struggling to get by. They're either in poverty or extreme poverty. And that's a big deal for all of us in the room. And that's why you came here today to Oxford, I'm sure. So this is a cocoa farmer. So just to give you an example, and cocoa is obviously a pretty critical raw material for Mars. You can't make chocolate without cocoa. There are about 5 million cocoa farmers in the world. And they typically, a typical farmer would have a couple of hectares. And he'll produce about 1 ton of cocoa per year. So that equates to about 80 cents a day of income. And he's supporting his whole household on 80 cents a day. He doesn't grow much else. It's pretty much all cocoa. So as we all know, that's about half the World Bank definition of extreme poverty. So we're not even close to the extreme poverty limit on many of these materials. And I could have picked any example. I could have picked coffee. I could have picked rice. I could have picked mint. I could have picked palm. Any of these smallholder crops. Typically, the farmers are a long way away from extreme poverty. Never mind poverty level, never mind a living wage. So we've got a huge gap. So we've got a lot of people, and we've got a huge gap to where we need to be. But it's not just about these farmers around the world just getting by. We know that this is connected to mortality. 50,000 people a day are dying as a result of poverty. So this isn't just about getting by. This is about mortality. So this is a huge issue. But you might say, well, hasn't there been huge progress on eradicating poverty? The Millennium Development Goals set a target of halving extreme poverty in 15 years. And we've all heard the news that 5 years ahead of schedule, that target was achieved. It halved extreme poverty in 10 years. So what's going on? Why are we still talking about this then? So what drove that reduction in extreme poverty, global extreme poverty, over that 15-year period? Was it A, improved world crop prices? Anybody think it was that? Sort of leading the witness here, aren't I? So in fact, world crop prices have generally fallen or stabilized. They have certainly not gone up. Was it improved crop productivity? Anybody think that? Well, perhaps to a certain extent on certain materials, but in general, it wasn't that. And on many materials, it hasn't really changed dramatically over the last 25 years. And in general, smallholder farmers are probably, their productivity is maybe half what industrial farming levels are. So it hasn't really been that. So what has it been? It's been this, hasn't it? So that story, that halving of global extreme poverty, is a China story. And it's a story of farmers moving away from agriculture to the urban economy. And so we haven't really fixed the problem. We've just moved a bunch of people away from the problem. So fundamentally, we collectively have not made a whole lot of progress on changing rural poverty. So it's still a challenge ahead of us. So many people, big gap, not a whole load of progress. It's not a great story so far, is it? Let's just compare a couple of things. Climate change. Everybody's talking about climate change, aren't they? Sure, you've all been talking about climate change. Certainly politicians have been talking about climate change. Non-government organizations talking about climate change. The world has been talking about climate change, as they should. It's a huge issue. And in fact, 189 million people have been talking about it on social media in the last year. So this has caught the imagination of the world, I would say, from man in the street all the way through to global presidents. What about poverty? people talking about poverty? Not so much. 7 million people have been talking about poverty on social media. So we have a problem. We have a big number of people involved in this issue. We have a big gap to where we need to get to. We have, frankly, a lack of real progress, and we have an issue that's not really in the public conscience. And so that's, I think, the context to which we are coming together today to debate and to collaborate about what we do next. I'd argue this is the elephant in the sustainability room. We are not going to become sustainable as businesses and as communities unless we solve this problem of poverty. So business is fighting poverty. There's been lots of efforts. I'm not saying nobody's been working on this, but frankly, we haven't yet made enough impact. So what's it going to take? And I thought I would just share with you how Mars is thinking about this. And we think there are 4 things that are critical for us to accelerate the progress going forward. So the first is confronting the reality. And this is what I think we're trying to do here. We're talking about the issue. We're facing into the issue. We're understanding what's going on. So we, alongside many other corporates, have been mapping our supply chains and measuring our supply chains. So if I give you an example, I was buying cocoa for Mars globally 15 years ago. We didn't even know what country our cocoa came from. We were buying a specification that we knew came from West Africa. We didn't know whether it came from Cameroon or Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana or Nigeria. And that was the state of global supply chains. You just didn't know. It came through maybe 5 sets of hands before it came to you. You just didn't know. And we didn't know what country it came from. We certainly didn't know under what social and environmental conditions it was being produced at that stage. That's all changed. The world is becoming ever more transparent. We know now exactly where our materials are coming from, and we have a pretty good idea of the social and environmental conditions that they're produced under. That's happened within 15 years. You think 15 years forward, we're going to need to know exactly and be able to measure and demonstrate what conditions. So that wave of transparency is allowing us to start to confront the reality. We now know. It's not acceptable to say we don't know anymore. We now know, and we're starting to confront the reality and the scale of the challenge. The second thing is, I think, committing to solve it. And I've used the word to solve there rather than to improve. So our point of view is that this is not about making it a bit better. There's lots of things that are making it a bit better. We have to fundamentally step change this. We have to solve this if we're going to solve the issues of sustainability. The specific commitment that Mars has made on this looks like this. So everyone working within our value chain, our extended value chain, and that goes through multiple stages, typically back to farming, should earn sufficient income to have a decent standard of living. So that isn't out of extreme poverty or out of poverty. It is a level above that, a decent standard of living. So why is that? Why have we done that? Why is that important? Well, the moral imperative is obvious. You wouldn't be in the room if you didn't understand the moral imperative. But the business imperative is also becoming more and more obvious. If we are to have a sustainable business that's going to be successful in 25 years' time, 50 years' time, then at some point those farmers are going to have a choice. Maybe they don't have a choice today, or they don't think they have a choice today. But as the world becomes more and more transparent, they're going to realize that they do have a choice, and they're not going to stay in extreme poverty and grow the crops that we need. So it's in our interests as business that we solve this problem. Otherwise, we're not going to have supply chains supplying what we need for the products that are sitting on all those supermarket shelves around the world. So it's in the business interest. Beyond that, if you think about sustainable development, all the other things we need to solve, human rights issues, climate change, water, land issues, we know that income's at the heart of that. If we don't solve poverty, we don't solve any of those other things. They'll never become sufficient reinvestment to solve those other issues either. So it's at the heart of all of the issues, I would argue. So what's the third element beyond committing to solve? We need some innovation, because many of the things that we've tried haven't worked particularly well collectively. So we need some innovation. We've been experimenting with some few different models in the last few years, which we think have promise and could provide real scale. So just a couple of examples. Cocoa Action. So I've talked a fair bit about Cocoa Action. As John said, I'm the chairman of the World Cocoa Foundation. What we've been trying to do there is to build a really powerful pre-competitive collaboration across the industry. So we've got the 10 biggest companies, our direct competitors. So Mars's direct competitors, Nestle, Mondelez, Hershey, Ferrero, the big 5 chocolate companies of the world working together alongside the big 5 agribusinesses in cocoa, Cargill, Barry Callebaut, Olam, Blommer, all working together. We've all agreed on what the problem is. We've all pooled our knowledge on solutions that we've tried together. We're all measuring the same thing, and then we've all committed at scale. So we've committed as an initial phase to reach 300,000 farmers in West Africa with the same intervention and to work together and measure progress together. I think this is pretty unique, and I think it's a model that you could replicate into many other materials. It's not, I'm not declaring success, but I think what we have built is real trust across the industry, which will set us up for making real progress. The other one here is an innovative investment fund. The Livelihoods Fund for Family Farming is something we launched a couple of years ago alongside Danone, another major food business. And the idea here is to bring a new systemic approach to smallholder farming. We're doing that through perhaps 20 or 30 projects across different materials, different geographies, tackling both the poverty and the environmental footprint of smallholder farming. We've pledged 120 million collectively to this fund. We're going to reach a couple of 100,000 farmers. So these are reasonable scale initiatives. They're not going to solve the entire problem, but they are, I think, proving grounds for new models and new innovation that I think can lead to real scale. So the final element, collaborative learning. So sure, we're going to get some collaborative learning from working in those specific segment initiatives, but we believe there is a need and a gap for more significant collaborative learning. Think about climate change, back to climate change. So what has climate change movement got going for it? It's got a common set of metrics. Everybody knows you measure this by CO2 equivalent. Everybody is measuring it by CO2 equivalent. It's got a common goal. Everybody knows that we need to limit the warming of the planet to no more than 2 degrees. And you can break that down into what that means for a country, for a company, for an individual. We have a common language of the problem. And everybody knows what some of the main solutions are. We have to move from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We have to stop deforestation. We have to move away from the wrong refrigerants to the right refrigerants. Everybody knows what some of the key levers are to solve this problem. And there's a high level of awareness and everybody's working on it. And we are starting to make progress. That isn't true for poverty. We still haven't aligned on what the right goals are, perhaps what the metrics are, what the roles of the key actors are. We certainly do not have a playbook of all the right solutions. We don't understand which interventions are really working and which ones are not. We've been measuring more about projects than we have about impact. So I would argue that we are a long way behind where the climate change movement is, and we have to put some of those things in place if we're going to be successful together. So collaborative learning, we think, is key to bring people together to solve those issues. So today we are announcing that we're launching an initiative that we're calling the Farmer Income Lab. So this is something that Mars is behind, but we see this as a collaborative learning space where we're going to tackle some of those big questions. We're going to pool the existing knowledge and we're potentially going to do new research to get to some of those core understandings that allow us then to move forward together. We call this a collaborative think, do tank. So this is about action learning. It's about pooling knowledge and then trialing it in the field. And some of those initiatives that you've seen, whether it's the Livelihoods Fund for Family Farming or Cocoa Action, are places we can then trial what we learn from this, and other companies can trial in their supply chain. So we're launching this today. I think there's going to be some further discussion through the next couple of days. We're clearly looking for partners and looking for people to collaborate with on this. It's great that we're doing this here in Oxford because, and I'm sure there's some people from Oxfam in the room, which was founded here in Oxford. They've agreed to come on board as our first trusted partner to help us advise us on this initiative. So anybody from Oxfam in the room? There we are. Thank you for your support. And I think it's like 75 years, isn't it, since you guys... 1942. So 75-year anniversary of Oxfam. So it's very apt that we're here bringing them on board as a key partner. So, I think hopefully what I've done is hopefully set up the context of why agriculture and poverty are inextricably linked and key to this issue. So huge issue, huge number of people, big gap that we've got to reach. Arguably, we haven't made the progress we need, and the world is not yet focused on this issue. So I think that's our context. I offered you some thoughts about how we, Mars, are tackling this, and I think what I do see, and what actually gives me a huge amount of optimism, is to think that business really is starting to fight poverty, and that businesses like Mars and many of our peers are getting their act together, and as you see, I think have to be at the core of making progress on this issue. So thank you for your attention. Hopefully you have a great couple of days, and look forward to collaborating with many of you. Thank you.
Will you take some questions? Just a couple of questions.
Oh, you'll get the Q&A now, do we?
Okay, so this is where I have to make a choice. I've got a fabulous sponsor here, but I know you guys want a lot of time to network both at the break and at lunch. So we have people with microphones. What you're going to do is you take the microphone from them, you're going to nod your head. The nod of the head means I'm going to ask a really short question. And then, can you give a rather short answer?
I can.
Okay, so let's get the microphones. No. Can I see the microphones up in the air? Raise your hand if you'd like a mic. So we've got 3 hands down here, 1 here. Why don't we go right here first?
Good morning. Hello, hello, hello. Does it work? Can you hear me? Hello? Vivina Berla from Saron Asset Management. Quick question. The role of finance in helping corporations achieve their goals. And in particular, there seems to have been a major distrust between business, government, and finance in actually collaborating. What is Mars' thought? What are Mars' thoughts about it?
That's not an easy yes-no answer, this one. I think the short answer to that is I agree with you that I don't think we've yet got powerful collaboration on financing. Often this has been about corporates trying to do it on their own, and the scale of the challenge is massive. So we have to find new mechanisms. I think things like Cocoa Action, where you bring the industry together, actually help, because no longer does a government need to talk to 10 companies. No longer does a donor need to talk to 10 companies. You can come and package a sectorial transformation. So I think that's one way we may find more effective ways of working together to simplify the partnerships.
Okay. And let's take 2 questions over here, and then unfortunately we're going to have to move on.
Hi, good morning. Stephen Williams. I'd just like to ask you about the innovative interventions that you mentioned in that 4-part circle. Can you outline what those interventions are?
I guess in the interest of time, I'm probably better just pointing you to the website, and then that both of them have got covered extensively. The fact they're innovative doesn't make them that simple to explain in 2 minutes. But have a look and then obviously contact us. I think that's probably the best. I'm going to get beaten up otherwise.
Hello, I'm Claudia Bush, and I'm with the Better Cotton Initiative, which is similar to your Cocoa Action, and we work with 1.5 million smallholder cotton farmers right now. I'm going to put this out to you and also to the room, because we can't solve it, but I'd like to talk about it, is sustainability of our partnerships. Once we get in and we train and we bring the farmers to a certain scale, if the funding goes away, what's going to happen, and how do we maintain the same sustainability? We have a fund provided by our apparel brands, but that support them right now.
Yeah, no, great. And the Better Cotton Initiative are doing great work, I know. I think the trick is this, not to be satisfied with better, but we have to get to sustainable. Because if we just get to better, then it's not sustainable. As soon as the support goes away, the system hasn't got to a tipping point of sustainability. If we can double, triple the income, we get to a point where the farmer's reinvesting, and then the support, I think, can move away. So I think that's a short answer to a complex question.
We're done with questions. I apologize.
It was going to be really short, too, I promise.
It was not only going to be short, it was going to be a great question.
So brief. You don't even know how good it was.
Tell you what, you're going to get together with him directly, and you get an individual answer.
Man,
and if it's really good...
I feel like a VIP right now. This is great.
Thank you.
All right.
Will you give Barry a round of applause, please? Next, I would like to introduce Vasuki Shastry, who is Global Head for Public Affairs and Sustainability at Standard Chartered Bank. He is responsible for coordinating policies and positions around political issues, reputational risk, and also matters having to do with regulatory issues. He also looks after the bank's global engagement and sustainability and community investment. And previously, he worked at both the International Monetary Fund and as a journalist. So please welcome Suzuki. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to thank Zahid. I'd like to thank John. Thanks to Business Fights Poverty for inviting me here, particularly on a Monday morning to take me away from the office. It's wonderful planning. I've been reflecting a lot about poverty, the role of business, and the role of governments in preparation for this presentation. And the biggest reflection I had, I'm from India, a country that has struggled for many, many years in combating poverty. And I reflected a bit about what was business's role in poverty, say, before the MDGs were established. And I think all of us would have struggled to figure out what precise role business played. For example, when China opened up in 1979, when India opened up in 1991. The basic presumption always was poverty reduction was the primary role of governments, because governments were accountable to their people. Business probably played a marginal role in investing in creating employment, but the fundamental responsibility vested with government. And this was the belief that both India and China, very ironical, two countries that accounted for over 60% of global GDP until the 1850s, essentially originated the idea of capitalism way before Adam Smith wrote his treatise. In India, we have this hundi system, which was the original bill discounting method for vendors to pay each other. And somewhere in the midst of time, our leaders discovered the joys of socialism. And for 50 years, both India, if you track economic growth in India and China coming out of 1945, it was 1%, 2%. In India, we had this wonderful description given by economists. India was growing at the rate, we were told, this was the Hindu rate of growth. That this is a very traditional society. Many people believed in reincarnation. And thus, the cultural determinism of the time was India could never grow at 8% to 10%. And I hear similar things about companies. This company is too large and complicated, will never be able to change. So I think one thing we should do as an outcome for this conference is to take such determinism and hopefully place it in the garbage bin. Because I think the big lesson here is if two big countries, India and China, over the course of the last 3 decades, have taken really impressive strides in reducing poverty. By most estimates, a billion 2 have come out of absolute poverty in these 2 countries. If you go back in history, there hasn't been this level, this staggering level of poverty reduction. I mean, you could go back even to the Industrial Revolution. You won't find the speed with which this has happened. But obviously, the problem has not been resolved. We still find absolute poverty in many parts of the world, Africa, in Central America. And the wonderful thing now is we actually have a collaborative model on which to work on. Because what India and China did when they decided that socialism was not working for them was they felt that the basic fundamental policy in both the countries was on self-reliance. And both countries had come out different kinds of colonial experience and believed that we had to make everything ourselves. We just could not depend either on domestic private enterprise and could not rely certainly on the foreigners because probably all of them worked for the CIA and had an underhanded role in destroying the country. As a result of which, for a long period of time, self-reliance didn't work. So the basic proposition that the leaders of the 2 countries, and Deng Xiaoping famously once said, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. And so this pragmatism flowed through. And the big element of the pragmatism was, why don't we take ideas from outside? Why don't we involve our private enterprise? Why don't we take foreign investment? And that's the only way to grow the economy. And this is where I think in the last 3 decades, our beliefs, our philosophy on the role of business in helping countries reduce poverty has really flourished. We still have a long way to go, but I think we can use some of the ideas that has come out of 30 years' experience of India and China. Now the chart that you see here, and many of you have been craning your necks to see what this is about. This is a brief introduction to Standard Chartered Bank. Now, Standard Chartered Bank has started in my hometown, Mumbai, India, in 1853. The mandate to establish the bank was given by Queen Victoria to James Wilson, who also was the publisher of The Economist, who founded The Economist magazine. And James Wilson had a very, very simple mandate. He wanted to go to India, he wanted to go to China, and into Singapore. This was the thriving trading hubs of the British Empire at that time, and said he wanted to create a trade finance bank. And that ultimately led to what is today Standard Chartered Bank. And we finance 6% of global trade. At the heart of it, we're a trade finance bank. We help companies and individuals and countries access world markets. And there are many lessons that we have taken from India and China. And we've been, we absolutely have had a ringside view of the tremendous growth that has happened in these 2 countries. A couple of lessons that we have learned is you need to begin with purpose. And I know that purpose has moved away. It's very fashionable in the 1980s to talk about corporate purpose. We came out of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, particularly for a bank, given all the omissions and the commissions committed by my fellow bankers in Europe and the US. There's a fundamental disbelief on whether finance could play an appropriate role in helping society and facilitating economic growth. And the lazy response to the question is, why do you exist? In the case of a bank, because we have a license to operate. And I think the license to operate is a very, very narrow definition of purpose, because in a broader sense, society has given us a license to operate. And that societal license presupposes a couple of beliefs. First thing is we do no harm. And in the case of Standard Chartered, this manifests itself. We make sure that we adhere to the highest rules of conduct. We make sure that in the lending that we provide to our markets, we also adhere to high environmental and social standards. Barry mentioned climate change being a profound challenge for all of us. Translating that into finance would really mean we commit to 1.5%. We make sure that the companies that we fund really understand that, if this is a coal company, you have to understand that there should be a pathway outside of coal, because that's the world that we are all headed to. If you're working in forestry, that means that we're working with the forestry companies, again, to make sure that they're sustainable practices that are followed. And we do this with the recognition that if Standard Chartered does the right thing by coal, does the right thing by forestry, doesn't mean the problem is going to be resolved. So you need to bring in the much broader set of actors. This includes local communities, our governments, foundations, NGOs. Compared with 10 years ago, we're talking to all of these players on a more active basis in trying to define what can we do right by our markets. There are a couple of preconditions, I think, in this collaboration. I think large corporations tend to be heavily siloed, tend to be reluctant to want to reach out and work with other partners, particularly social partners. And I think there's a great deal of willingness to work with business, in certain cases to work with government. When we talk about social entrepreneurship and social partners, I think the private sector immediately shies away. And I think we've kind of learned that if we don't bring the NGOs and other social partners into this equation, we'll never be able to solve the underlying issue. So let me cite 3 examples where, and these are live examples, where we have learned lessons. And I think our belief here should be, let's not repeat old mistakes, let's make new mistakes. The Ebola crisis in West Africa, for us, was a stunning example of what collaboration can do. Very quick snapshot, 2015, 3 countries in West Africa, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, were impacted by Ebola. It had every signs of becoming a pandemic. And I think if you went through the first 6 months of 2015, there was a real sense that public intervention was not working. Standard Chartered operates in Sierra Leone. We've been there for 100 years. We've got a staff of 170. And we play an absolutely critical role in connecting Sierra Leone to the rest of the world. So when the epidemic broke out, there was an absolute necessity for the international aid agencies and the UN to ship medicine, to ship supplies, in a dramatic case, to bring in 100 Cuban doctors who were willing to go and volunteer to deal with the epidemic. And all of this, you need old-fashioned finance. And I think in the first 2 months, all actors stumbled in trying to figure out the best way of making sure that the 3 countries really had to get medicines, supplies, and doctors in time. And then we quickly figured out there needed to be a division of labor. And the division of labor in this case worked out to the French taking the lead on Guinea, the Americans taking a lead on Liberia, and the UK taking a lead on work with Sierra Leone. And this immediately devolved responsibility for Standard Chartered to take responsibility for Sierra Leone. And I think we very quickly learned that by bringing about this very active collaboration, learning from the mistakes we made in the first 2 months, we were able to resolve the underlying problem of making sure that supplies and doctors reached on time. Obviously, there's a bigger issue of what lessons we learn to ensure that the epidemic doesn't take place again. Second example would be on Power Africa, which was President Obama's initiative announced in 2013. Now, there's a dramatic statistic that I read about Nigeria that really was eye-popping. That Tokyo's Narita Airport has more power generation capacity than all of Nigeria. So if you look at satellite imagery of Africa, you see an enormous bright spot that is South Africa, and you see an enormous dark spot, and that's the rest of Africa, where power generation capacity has simply trailed economic growth, and in fact has hindered economic growth. So when President Obama decided that he was going to place the prestige of the US government, of the USAID, in making sure that 5 or 6 countries in Africa at least started building power generation capacity, we decided to collaborate, being the only international bank of any size in Africa, decided to collaborate with USAID in providing the financing. And the kind of financing that we're doing today on power generation is very different from what we would do, for example, in Europe or the US, because you need an element of guarantee. No private sector developer is willing to put money into a frontier market such as Africa without some liability being covered by agencies such as the USAID. So we were able to come up with a creative solution where the US government provided an element of guarantee, we put money along with the developer, as a result of which we've started the process of Africa trying to meet its own power needs. It's a long journey, it's a long haul, and indeed, we've got to figure out whether the fuel mix that Africa has in place, it should not rely on coal, given that in 5 or 10 years' time, all countries have to meet obligations of Paris. So this is a journey, I would say, where there are going to be stumbles, there are going to be missteps, and I think we should not be disheartened by those stumbles and missteps as long as we recognize that no individual agency can do things on their own. So you've got to set the right expectations, you've got to be open and transparent with your partners, and at the same time, be very ambitious in your goals. If you think that you're going to be working with a difficult set of stakeholders and scale back on your expectations, then the outcome is not going to be beneficial to anyone, either the country or the corporation. Final point about this slide, and we've got this in our headquarters in Basing Hall in London, and it updates almost on a live basis. So every time Standard Chartered provides a letter of credit to a company in any one of our 68 markets, we get an update on our big screen in the office, also signifying the volume and value of these trades. And in the context of the political context of where we are, trade is getting a bad reputation. There's a belief, there's a widely held belief that trade may have benefited the world economy for a long period of time, but right now it's just all the benefits are geared towards disadvantages for countries. But I think collaboration, and I think if you look at East Asia, the East Asian economic miracle, that was built on trade, that was built on collaboration, and that was built on impact. And I hope our political leaders, as we navigate, as we discuss the impact of globalization, will recognize that trade plays a central role in ensuring that the global economy works for all. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 questions this time, and if you want to have one of them, I'll give it to you. Okay, hands up if you've got a question. Again, you're nodding as you acknowledge that you're asking a short question. So we've got one at the very back there. Can we get a microphone to the very back row? And I like the way everybody introduced themselves earlier, so do that briefly also.
So my question is really on the impact of technology. Oh, sorry, introduce myself. Sorry, apologize. My name's Alpesh Doshi. I'm an entrepreneur building businesses around financial inclusion.
Well done.
Sorry. So my question is the fact that there's a massive impact of technology in improving all our lives, and the banking industry is about to go under fundamental change. What is Standard Chartered doing about that?
Yes, and we're doing a couple of things. But technology is going to bring about absolute transformation, I think, in the markets that we operate in. And one way of doing it is to use technology to drive efficiencies, and efficiencies not from the perspective of destroying jobs, but efficiencies in terms of adding value. A quick example of this is a collaboration we have with a Silicon Valley firm in making sure that our letters of intent, which at the moment are incredibly cumbersome, take 3 weeks for a supplier to generate a letter of credit that goes through. We want to reduce that time to 3 days. And I think that will have a dramatic impact on efficiency. And I assume the underlying question was what happens to jobs.
Okay, let's take one more question. Hands up. Right there. Can we get a mic to this gentleman? Keep your hand up. Down further.
My name is Sohaimi. I'm from Malaysia. A retiree, not a pensioner. Now, my question pertains to a bottom line of Standard Chartered Bank. As you pursue social obligations, objectives, sustainability, I'm sure it will affect the bank's overall bottom line. Maybe not in the long term, but in the short term. So how do you explain that to your shareholders? Are your holders willing to accept as it is? And so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Salamat pagi. We've set out 11 sustainability aspirations precisely to answer the question of aligning our business goals with that of sustainability. And I don't think corporations should be defensive about aligning their business goals with sustainability. I think the returns issue is a much, much broader issue. It's got nothing to do with sustainability. I think all of us need to be sustainable. That's the world we live in. And we need to figure out how we drive value based on that. Shareholders may be impatient. Shareholders may be short-term oriented. But I think we've got sufficient shareholders in our mix who are willing to be patient and wait for the long term.